Thank you for listening to Forever Shelfmates. As a small podcast, we rely on word of mouth and ratings to gain new listeners. If you like the show, please be sure to tell your friends, family, landlord, colleagues, anyone who will listen, and leave us a 5-star rating on the listening platform of your choice. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to Forever Shelfmates, everybody. I'm Cheryl, and I love books, and I love to talk about the books that I read. And I'm a librarian, so I have a job where I get to talk about all of the books that I love to read. I'm here with my co-librarian and BFF, Mirele.
I'm back. This month we're talking...
Did you miss me? She missed me. She's laughing out of affection.
This is true. I have missed you.
Now she's crying out of affection. So sweet.
This month we're talking about nonfiction. We're discussing my pick, Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Before we get started, our usual warning, we will be spoiling the book. So if you haven't read it and don't want to have the plot ruined for you, pause the episode, run out to your favorite local indie bookstore or library of some kind, and come back after you read it. Don't worry, we'll wait.
Shelfmates, reading books is what we do. Shelfmates, and we talk about them too. I'm Cheryl. I like light and fluffy.
Meryl, I like dark, stuffy.
Shelfmates, we're so glad that you are here to hear us.
Let's dive in, shall we?
We're joined today by our amazing producer, Aaron, since this is one of his favorite books. Welcome back, Aaron.
Yay.
Yay! Hi!
We're so happy to have you to talk about this very, very, very dark book, which you would think it was Mirele's pick based on how dark it actually is.
Indeed you would. And I laughed through the whole book thinking that you picked it, Cheryl.
You laughed through the whole book?
I laughed through a lot of parts.
It was Schadenfreude. That's what she's getting at.
It was just so funny and ironic that Cheryl picked this book. It's really the opposite of the type of thing she enjoys.
That's true.
Because there's a lot of death and frostbite.
Yes. So let's talk about what this book is about. So this is a nonfiction book. So it is about an actual real event that occurred in 1996 when there was a horrible accident at the top of Mount Everest.
Yes.
And that's the basic plot. And it's real, so you can look it up if you really wanted to and learn more about it. But reading this book will give you some very interesting and depressing details about what it is like to climb Mount Everest.
Yes.
Very personal.
Right. Many people perished on their way down from Mount Everest, some of them on their way up from Mount Everest. And this book was written by a journalist named Jon Krakauer, who was hired to go on the expedition and cover what it's like for these. This was a commercial expedition company. So he was doing an article about most of them were very, very wealthy tourists who wanted to climb Mount Everest. And looks like they got on the wrong expedition, huh, Cheryl? That's not funny. I should know.
No, it's not.
No.
But his article was on, I think it started out as an article on the commercialization of the climbing Mount Everest.
Right.
And then he managed to sort of beg his way on the expedition because he is a climber himself, which maybe you should ask me how I know that. How do I know that Jon Krakauer? I know that because I read the wrong book at first.
Which book did you read?
Oh, I'm so terrible. So this was my pick, but apparently between the time I picked it and the time I read it, I actually thought it was one of Krakauer's other books, Into the Wild.
Say that again. Say it again.
Hi, my name is Cheryl, and I read the wrong book, even though I picked it. In fact, it was so funny because I read the whole book, I put it down, and then I texted both Aaron and Mirele to be like, okay, I finished it. And then I was like, wait, I think I read the wrong book. So then I had to go look at our little planning spreadsheet. And sure enough, I read the wrong book.
I got that text sitting on the floor of a Ross Dress for Less. For unrelated
where
reasons.
You were when Cheryl sent you that text? It was a historic moment.
Yeah. Oh. So I was a little bit of a dum-dum and then had to go out and get the real book. But Into the Wild is also a very interesting read, but he talks a little bit about how he's like into climbing and especially into ice climbing.
He talks
So it
a lot
wasn't-
about that in this book too.
Well, that's true. That's true, which is how he begged his magazine to like get him a spot on the expedition. So instead of just going to the base camp and like interviewing people, he actually climbed up Everest.
And he profiles the different people on the trip, and he describes in depth, and I would say in tedious depth,
This is true.
every single expedition that ever was. No, he describes many expeditions up Everest that have taken place in history and all the disasters that have occurred. He describes in depth the conditions that under which you need to. He describes the conditions of climbing Everest: the cold, the frostbite, the gear, the food, the toilets, everything. It's all there. That was interesting. I like that part.
That's gross.
But in terms of the overview of historical climbs up Everest, it jumps back and forth a lot. And it's always giving you statistics like this mountain is 5,474 and a half feet. And it's located in the blah, blah, blah region of blah, blah, blah. And that was boring to me. But I think Aaron likes that.
I liked that because that's how my brain works. Like if I were reading this book, every time he offhandedly mentioned a former expedition, I would have immediately put it down and Googled it in order to find exactly what he wrote.
I'm going to be honest, I would have done that too.
And that's the way you're supposed to read books, really. But
I did do a lot of Googling whilst reading this book and afterwards because I was so fascinated by the climbing of Everest that like I had to know more about
There's just so much.
All of us went down rabbit holes, not the same rabbit hole, but it was all connected to Everest. Like I went down the rabbit hole of what is frostbite and what happens when your skin turns black and falls off.
Oh my God.
And Cheryl went down the hole of like
what expeditions have like happened, why it's still so crowded, and like different. I just found like every documentary that was on Disney Plus about Everest and watched them all.
It was fascinating. And Aaron went down the hole of I must map every single location that Krakauer mentions, right?
It's awesome though. I needed that too though. So we all sort of needed, well, not all, Aaron and I needed to see pictures of every single spot on the hike up Everest because I needed to be able to envision what it looked like. And that's actually part of the reason I set up the documentaries. I actually wanted to see what it looked like to climb.
Right. Like I wanted to actually see what does stage 4 frostbite look like on Beck Weather's nose.
Oh, that's so gross. I don't want to know what that looks like.
Mirele, you're the weird one here. We all went down rabbit holes, but you're the odd one out. You're the weird one here.
She went for the survivalist, like what happens when you're not surviving kind of thing.
Or when you are surviving. And then I read Beck Weathers. He was one of the tourists on this fated expedition, and he survived against all odds. And I read his memoir, which I like more than this one because it's more personal and it doesn't have so many facts about the statistics of mountains.
I'll add it to our we recommend.
Yes, I recommend it.
Recommended by Mirele.
Right.
Beck Weather's story is fascinating, but we'll get there.
Yes.
Okay, back to
Jon Krakauer and his story. So he manages to get on this expedition. So he flies to Nepal, and there are many steps to even get to base camp.
So the first step is you've got to walk from Kathmandu to Everest Base Camp. You go through a bunch of little towns. The last one before Everest Base Camp, Krakauer spent like 3 or 4 days at.
I don't remember the name.
I don't remember the name, but that's the gross one. Where people
were. It was
the
gross one?
Yeah.
Yes.
That way, Mirele, do you remember the name? I feel like you do because you had a lot to say about.
Oh man, I don't totally remember, but it was really, really gross. Like
they had poor sewage facilities.
They didn't have any sewage facilities.
Okay, I was trying to be nice about it, but yeah.
And they have all these climbers who are climbing up from the Nepalese side, and climbers, you poop. Everybody needs to poop. Where's the poop going to go? Well, it's going to go on the ground where you're walking, and people were diseased and had stomach viruses and everything. And the place sounded like hell.
Yeah,
really.
I'm gonna agree with that.
One of the
yeah,
guides who's going to be important, who was on the expedition that Krakauer was on, which was run by a very famous mountaineer named Rob Hall. Rob Hall had hired two other guides, one of whom was Andy Harris. Andy shared a tent with Jon Krakauer
Yeah.
for much of the expedition. So when they were in this hellhole, Andy was one of the people who had a terrible stomach virus, and he would literally barely make it out of the tent before he just pooped all over the ground.
this is why I will never, ever, 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 ever go to Mount Everest.
Right. If I had to share a tent with you and you were about to poop in the tent, I mean, like I would just go home.
I can't disagree with that. I'm going to be honest. If I felt that terrible, I'd want to go home.
Even if you pooped right outside the tent, I'd go home.
Do you guys want to see the popcorners again? If you keep talking, we're going to see my popcorners again.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so after that, we finally get to base camp. And base camp is sort of the last like town, and I use town with like air quotes, but it's the last place you can really be helicopter rescued out of an Everest expedition. And it's the place where everybody sort of starts. And so that's where they get to, and it's less gross. I mean, less gross. And it's where you start your real acclimatization there, because from there you're going to go up to the next camp and then come back down, and then you're going to go up to the 2 camps and then come back down. And so you spend a lot of time at base camp. They have like dining facilities. Like it sounds like an actual like place.
Yeah. If you see the movie, there's a movie Everest that came out. And who does it star? Like Jake Gyllenhaal? I don't remember who, but they show base camp as being this kind of fun, awesome, like climbers summer camp feel. Like people have musical instruments and they have liquor and like they try to have fun while they're there.
I don't think I'd drink the liquor if I was about to start climbing, but that's me.
Yeah. So, and there's other expeditions there too from all over the world, including some expeditions that are led by idiots.
Yeah. So in 1996, it was not just this expedition being led by Rob Hall. There were like 5 other expeditions going essentially at the same time.
More than that.
Okay, more than that. I don't remember how many, but there were a lot. And so there were a lot of people trying to all climb Everest at the same time, which was part of the reason that Jon Krakauer was hired to write about climbing Everest, because this had become a thing. And frankly, it's still a thing. So, anyway, so then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not every team had as qualified a guide as Rob Hall. I mean, even though it ended in tragedy, Rob Hall was really one of the best. There were other teams that were headed by the Taiwanese and the South Africans and people who had teams that had histories of getting stuck on mountains and having to get bailed out by other climbers.
So the most important thing about base camp is that at this point, and despite the fact they're like competing expeditions, all the expeditions have to work together because there's so many people. So the way that it works when you climb up through Everest, there's oftentimes fixed ropes, which are set by Sherpas sent by each expedition.
Yeah, the Sherpas are really the like unsung heroes of climbing Everest, because they do all the hard work so that the paying tourists don't have to do this themselves. And they risk their lives every single day, every single year to do this. And
they get very little pay by Western standards. And something like 1 out of every 3 or 4 casualties on Everest is a Sherpa. I mean, they're carrying the tourist bags. The tourists, like, you can just walk up Everest with practically nothing except a little oxygen canister and some water. They're carrying everything for you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
That's
and as Erin said, they set up all the ropes so that you don't have to, which means risking your life to set up the ropes, right? Because if you're like trying to get over a crevasse, right, where you fall to your death
That's,
ice
oh my
rivers.
God,
I mean,
that's terrible. The way
it's
that they do. So the first thing that you come to when you leave base camp, which is already more than 3 miles above sea level,
yeah,
Is-
that's high.
is is the Khumbu, what's called the Khumbu Icefall, which is essentially a valley of huge, precarious pieces of ice, like 30, 40 feet high.
Which were called, I think, seracs. Is that right?
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Serac. It was called a Serac. And they can also break off and fall on you.
Yeah, it's essentially like an ice river that's still sort of moving. So like
A vertical ice river.
yeah. So if one of them happened to come loose and you were underneath, bye you. It sounds like it is the most treacherous part of
But it's
the
the most
climb.
it's the most technically difficult part of the climb. But because of the acclimatization, when you climb up this route of Everest, which is the more popular one, which I think is the south one, right?
Yes.
The southern route.
Yes.
You essentially you have to go through it like 8 or 10 times.
You have to keep going through
Yeah.
it. So that's horrifying.
Yeah. 3 out of the 4 weeks is you getting acclimatized.
Because if you don't, your
There are
brain,
many very bad things that will happen to you.
your lungs will stop working, your brain will stop working.
Your brain will start
Yeah.
leaking down your spine.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'm going to say this. I never wish to climb Everest ever.
There were
It's never
so
gonna
many, there were so many descriptions of like all this things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hypoxia, haste, all these conditions that can happen to you. There's reports, people when they're really, really cold and they're not acclimatized due to the lack of oxygen, they'll just kind of slow down and sort of stop and stare and not move. And that's when they freeze to death. In fact, there are a lot of bodies on Everest of people who stopped just like that and they froze to death in place.
Or who fell, couldn't get up and froze.
Yeah, and they don't bury them. They can't really get them down from where they are. So they just stay there. And so they have nicknames for all these bodies as you're going up to the top of Everest. Isn't that gruesome?
Yeah.
I hate that.
Yeah. Then I had to look that up.
Okay, I don't want to talk about it. Anyway,
I don't know how people do it, honestly. Like
Yeah.
that's something I definitely don't want to do.
but one of the ways that you get across the big like crevasses that are formed because of the way the ice is set up is across a ladder that's precariously tied into both sides of the ice. And one of the things that the Sherpas are tasked with doing is setting up that ladder.
Yeah. It's
Which-
terrifying.
it's
If you see
terrifying.
Everest, the movie, it's,
Oh my
it's like,
God.
oh, you can't forget that scene.
Because the Sherpas have to get across the ladder without it being secured.
I'm not going to do that.
Which is
That's
just
I don't know how people do that for a living.
it's
I don't.
terrifying. It's terrifying. But it's like it's part of the culture, the Sherpa culture, which I find fascinating.
And it's really an honor, I think, for people to be selected as Sherpas because it means you'll be able to provide for your families. You'll be able, like, it's a for the people who are and their communities. It's a really good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I can't imagine risking my life. Like, I'm not doing that as a librarian. I'm gonna say that.
It's somehow though, like it's like it's pride for them, but it's sometimes pride to a fault.
Yes.
They
Where
feel like they're
there's
expected to be able to do everything.
There's a Sherpa by the name of Ngawang Topchi, I think I pronounced that right,
Yeah.
who, while setting up oxygen canisters on Camp 2 or Camp 3, started to have symptoms of pulmonary edema because of the high altitude, but he refused to get help. To the point where by the time he passed out and was forced to get help, it was too late and he died a couple months later.
Yeah.
See,
we said this book was rather dark.
It's terribly dark. Anyway, after you manage to get through the Kumbu Icefall, if you have not been crushed by something, you walk through a canyon with reflecting sunlight everywhere called the Western Coombe, which is spelled CWM.
Because it's Welsh and
The Welsh don't believe in
therefore
vowels.
difficult to pronounce. I mean, I think that's the easiest Welsh word to pronounce.
Very well might be.
Yeah.
I actually, in one of the other books that I know Mirele read, there are Welsh words, and I did not know how to pronounce them until I listened to the audiobook. So Welsh is an incredibly difficult language to understand and to speak, I think. But Coombe is.
But it's
CWM.
also, it's what the Westerners call it.
Yes.
What's interesting, oh, go ahead.
There's another name for it in the Sherpa language, just like there is for a lot of things.
Yes. They have a totally different name for Everest, but even they refer to Everest as Everest, even though it has a totally different name.
What's interesting about the Coombe is that it gets broiling hot there. There's all these temperature extremes involved in climbing Everest, and I think that's because of where the sun hits.
When Jon Krakauer was walking through it, he was like, I was putting like snow on my head to cool myself off. And, and you don't really want to take off your like warm, your heavy duty clothes because it's still cold, but at the same time, you're really hot. When I was in Sweden, we did snowshoeing like up a hill, and we were wearing like base layers and like heavy coats and everything like that. And we were dying by the time we got to the top. And it's really dangerous actually to take off layers because it's still cold, even if you're sweating. So I found that fascinating that he was like, oh, and I put like snow on my head to try to like cool myself off.
Sounded awful.
It was.
I think you have to be a specific personality to like actually climb Everest, right? It's a lot, and I think that's what part of where I'm jumping ahead. Let's stop. So now we're in the Coombe.
All right, wait, I want to say one more thing about the Sherpas that we were talking about.
Yeah.
So the Sherpas also have like a big impact on the way things run on Everest because they're so important. So they have like a prayer ceremony before anybody climbs up Mount Everest, and they've got a bunch of rituals and customs about how you can and cannot treat Everest because they view Everest as a god who will fight back.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a very funny scene in the book.
He really kind of does.
There's a very funny scene in the book where two of the clients of some expedition are in a tent together amorously.
The word is sauce making.
That's what I was getting. The Sherpas go around like chanting like da da da, our sauce making sauce, and that made me laugh. That part made me laugh.
Yeah, it sounds immature to us, but they're laughing about it, but they were also terrified because they thought that having sex on the mountain could jeopardize the expedition. And so some of the Sherpas were really upset by that. I can't get that word out of my head. It's really kind of disturbing.
Sauce making?
Clearly that did not impact me nearly as much as the other stuff, because I did not remember sauce making, but now that you said it, I'm like, oh yeah.
In this book, did it talk about sauce making? Because I knew in Beck Weathers' memoir, it mentioned sauce making.
No, in this one, they also talked about it. They talked about the sauce making.
Yeah. We have, look, this book is real difficult because of the stuff that happens when they get to the summit. And so like, you have to have moments of levity, even if we're making fun because of sex, and how like, it was kind of offensive to the Sherpas, like religious, spiritual beliefs, right? But like with how dark this book gets, you have to find moments of humor. Otherwise this book is just so bleak.
Yeah.
So I think I remember it, but I can't remember what I thought about it, but like, we need those moments. And so
yeah. It's also
really sorry, Buddhists.
Like, we haven't even gotten to like the summit part of it.
No, we haven't gotten to the camp 2 yet. So, let's go.
Like this book is only like 150 pages, or no, it's not. Scratch that. I'm cutting that. Book. It's like 300 pages, right?
Something like that.
But it's still not as long as it seemed. Like when we're talking about it, it seems much longer because it's so dense.
Yes.
Because Jon Krakauer put in his postscript that what he tried to do was create the most full picture of the events that happened on the mountain with stories from everybody he could get a hold of.
Right. He did it, and he's a journalist, and it sounds very journalistic.
And this also came out of the fact that he wrote an article for the magazine. I think it was Outside or
Outside Magazine.
Outside Magazine. And he just felt like in the magazine article, he couldn't get across all the things he needed to say about what happened. And so this was his response. And so like, I think that like, yeah, it's really he has to give this picture, right? You have to know why it's important. You have to know why people climb Everest to understand the mentality of everybody who was there that day. So,
and even though he tries to be as accurate as possible, as soon as this came out, it was highly controversial because different people recount different things and they disagreed with him. And he was attacked by a lot of critics.
especially since we haven't gotten to like the higher up when you start needing oxygen, but like once your body isn't getting enough oxygen, you hallucinate. And there are definitely people who think things happened. He even says, I am sure that this happened. And then later on, when he talks to others of the survivors, they're like, that's not really what happened. And he's like, no, it totally did. And they're like, no, it totally didn't. And so there's no way to get a real, true, accurate picture, because once you're that high up with the lack of oxygen, it just does stuff. But let's get to Camp 2 and then Camp 3.
Right.
So we're on the Coombe.
After I think Camp 2 is at the top of, or Camp 1 is at the top of the ice fall.
Yes.
Okay.
Camp 2, I think, is at the end of the Coombe.
I think you're right.
After that, you hit, I believe the next step is climbing up the Lhotse face, which is the face of a mountain called Lhotse, which is right by Everest, that you have to climb up to in order to get to Everest.
Yes.
And that's treacherous in its own right because it's near vertical and you got to walk up it with your little, I don't remember what it was called.
Jetties, jeeters, jammies. There's a term. Your crampons and your jeeters or something.
It's basically it's a little clip that you put onto the rope that allows you to go up but doesn't allow you to go back down in case you fall.
It's very good for safety.
Yeah.
I don't want to fall. That's terrifying. And
Oh
this
my
is about
God.
the time when you start needing additional oxygen.
Yes. And the crampons are an important part that we kind of didn't touch on because they're an important part of mountaineering, and something that Krakauer says at the beginning about how ill prepared a lot of the people here, like on the mountain, are, is that they didn't even know how to put on crampons.
Right.
Which is a problem when you're climbing on ice, because they are essentially like ice picks attached to the bottom of your shoes, so that way you can walk across ice.
Yeah. Oh, there's one part, I think it's in this one and not the memoir that I read, where they're camped out. Maybe it was near the Lhotse face. They were camped out on this kind of icy cliff. And if you went out of your tent, there was a lot of ice, and then it was just a drop. And a lot of people would die because they would forget to put on their crampons if they went out of the tent. They
Oh
would
my
just
God, that's
slip.
terrifying.
Yeah.
I don't
My
think that
goodness.
was this,
Is
because
that
I think
not
I would
this?
remember
Okay.
that. That's
All right.
terrifying. All right, so we're now at
Anyway,
Camp 3.
so with Camp 3, you climb up from Camp 3. I think that it's farther up the Lhotse face, but just like a more gradual place from Camp 3. And now at this point, they've already lost a couple of climbers. Not dead, but
have turned around.
have turned
and gone
around
back
because
down.
they couldn't get and gone back down because they couldn't do it.
The wisest decision of their lives.
Yeah.
I've gone back down to base camp and where Rob Hall's base camp manager is, and kind of
And the doctor is.
the doctor is kind of a more relaxed environment. and they climb up to, at this point, after they've acclimatized, I think they reach Camp 4, which is on the South Pole. That's what I meant to say.
And that's where it's super windy and super cold and desolate.
And like there is a drop off one side.
Yeah, and that's where people
straight
slip
down. And people forget to put on their crampons because their brains just aren't working.
Yeah.
Yes. Especially if you choose not to take supplemental oxygen, which one of the guides, not the guides that are on the expedition that Jon Krakauer is,
One of the guides on Scott Fisher's team
is very much against using
it's a crutch. He sees it as a crutch.
Yeah, there's a thing, and this was terrifying to me, honestly, like hearing this, that it's like, well, there's some people that are like, well, if you use the extra oxygen, like you're not a real climber. And I just want to be like, dude, you're leading a bunch of people up to a place where like you hallucinate, you could die very easily by hallucinating. Like
it's literally
this guy, it's called the death zone. This guy's name is Anatoly Bukrev. Bukrev. He is a guide for Scott Fisher's expedition, and he is climbing without supplemental oxygen while being a guide. And he is Russian and has a slightly different view on what guides should do as opposed
That's
to
very true.
The traditional way, which I say traditional, the way that Scott Fisher, Rob Hall view it.
Yes, that is very true. And it comes back to sort of be a big issue because now we're at Camp 4 and they're about to summit, and it is May 9th, 1996.
And this is another place, this is a place where we can really point out how all the expeditions were kind of working together. Because while still at base camp, Rob Hall and all the other expedition leaders had a meeting wherein they divided up what's known as the summit window, which is the time in which the weather is good enough that you can actually summit Everest, which is very small, into like sections so that no day or time has too many expeditions trying to summit.
Which sounds really, really, really amazing, like people working together. But the problem is, as Mirele pointed out, you have to have same people who are making these decisions. And
a couple of expeditions who were not supposed to summit ultimately on May 10th, which is when Rob Hall and Scott Fisher's teams were supposed to summit, were also up at the camp with them. And that is the Taiwanese team, led by a guy named Makalu Gao, who on a training run with his team had to get rescued off of Mount McKinley in Alaska.
Yes.
One of his prouder moments.
I don't know how you're proud of having to be rescued by the National Park Service.
And the South African team led by Ian Woodall, who decided that he was too good for anything.
He's just an insane, eccentric asshole.
Also racist.
Yeah, and he just puts everybody's life in jeopardy. He says, I'm going to climb whenever I want to.
He put out his like mission statement to everybody was, you know what, y'all? I'm going to be this was right at the end of like apartheid in South Africa. So he was like, white people, black people, we're going to climb the mountain together. And then he leaves, and then he brings two, I think he called them candidates to be the African-American person to climb with them.
Not African-American. They're South African. Black South Africans, in addition to the white South Africans on the team. And they're supposed to compete. And then doesn't he leave them both behind?
Ultimately, he leaves them both behind, but I think that's because he claims that, okay, so in order to climb Everest, you need a permit for every person who goes higher than base camp. Right. So he claims that he put both their names on the permit, but he will only take one so that he can pick one. Right.
Yeah.
Turns out he only listed one of their names on the permit. And so the other one just came to Everest Base Camp for no reason.
Yeah.
He's a nice guy.
He's not at all racist. that's fine. He's also kind of crazy and he just did whatever the heck he wanted to do.
And so
And-
his team and the Taiwanese team are both at Everest Camp 4 when they're not supposed to be.
Yes. And that causes some big problems. And so the way it works when you summit is you actually start at like 10 o'clock at night. Because you have to get up a very treacherous path and get down before afternoon storms hit on Everest. And I think it's well known that there are afternoon storms on Everest. And in fact, they talk about like the turnaround time. Like if you are not to the summit by 1 or 2 o'clock or whatever, you turn around because it's too dangerous.
So before we get into what actually happened on May 10th, 1996, I think we should talk about how you get to the summit. So the first, from Camp 4, you have to climb up to what's known as the balcony, which is kind of like a rest spot almost, where you can sit and wait, relax a little bit. After which you climb across something that's kind of narrow. I don't remember what it's called, but it had a name.
That's fine.
Until you reach the south summit, which is a couple hundred vertical feet from the top and an hour or two still trek from the actual summit, but it's kind of like a false summit.
Yeah, it's a fake. Like, oh, I made it to the summit.
Fake you out.
No.
Then you continue to climb, and then before 2014, you'd come to something known as the Hillary Step, wherein you would climb up, which was essentially a 40-foot rock that you had to
vertical rock that only has one rope going up and one rope going down. One rope going up and down.
Yes.
So you're sharing the rope if you're going up or if you're coming back down. And all this time you're in the death zone.
And then at that point, you just have to you have to walk in 29,000 feet with no oxygen, with only a little bit of oxygen. But you have to walk up to the summit.
Right. And then after you complete the Hillary Step, you are at the summit.
But you don't stay long because you're also in the death zone. So you have to turn around pretty quickly.
And actually the more dangerous part is coming back down because your oxygen is probably like not as full as it was when you left. And it's actually more dangerous to go down than it is to go up.
And you also have to wait for oftentimes a bottleneck nowadays at the hill. Well, oftentimes what was a bottleneck at the Hillary Step in order to come back down.
Yeah, so extremely dangerous. Not a lot of oxygen.
One note about the Hillary Step, though, is that in 2014, there was an earthquake in Nepal that kind of destroyed it.
Yes.
So.
It was named after Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first. I mean, there was a Sherpa that was with him whose name was
Tenzing Norgay.
The two of them were the first ones to summit Everest.
And I think the two of them died, have both passed away since. And what they did, because it was in 1953, so probably they were not still alive. But what the two of them did is, to the day that they died, neither one would reveal who stepped on the summit first.
That's fair. Mm-hmm. They both did it. They did it together.
They did it together, and they kept it that way.
They were very clear that they both did it together.
They were very clear they did it together, and they were very clear that they would not tell.
Yeah.
And you can see a National Geographic special on how they discovered where Sir Edmund Hillary's body lies today. I think so. I think that's
you mean the one I watched?
Well, the one where they find the body and they think that
that was George Mallory.
Oh, oops, I missed
Mallory is the one.
Yeah, scratch that, blah, blah, blah. No.
Mallory was the one in like the 20s who people thought who died on the way back down, and nobody actually knows if he summited. People assume he didn't, but nobody knows for certain.
Yes. Anyways, okay, so now
let's talk about what happened on May 10th.
God. Oh boy.
Well, there was a storm.
Well, first we have to remember that there was a turnaround time. And they said Rob Hall said there is a turnaround time, only he was never clear on what that turnaround time actually was. And there were several people on, well, at least there was one person on the expedition. This was his third time, I think, trying to summit. And it's so expensive that he didn't have the money to be able to try again. So this was sort of his last shot, and he hadn't been able to make it up either time. Rob Hall also in the previous season had not had anyone summit because of weather and illness, I assume, and everything. And so like it was real important that the expedition make it to the summit.
Yeah. And the guy who was his third attempt, his name was Doug Hansen, and he was actually a postal worker who would save every single cent he made.
And he was sponsored by like an elementary school or something in Seattle, I want to say. And so he was sending back like pictures and letters and everything to the kids at the school, you know, chronicling his journey.
Yeah.
And so, and many of them also were not experienced climbers. Jon Krakauer was one of the few actual experienced climbers. And so he was constantly like ahead of everyone else, and then had to wait for people to catch up. And so when they started out, everything was okay. Ish.
They waited until the storm abated, and then they went in the middle of the night.
Yes.
And they started going up, and it was fine until it took some people longer
a lot
to get
longer.
up, a lot longer. And part of the reason it took them longer was because of they were suffering because of the conditions. I also think, was it because there wasn't too much crowding? The crowding came later. The bottleneck.
But crowding always comes at like the Hillary step when you're trying to go up and down that one rope.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of the bottlenecking happened. So I think Jon Krakauer made it to the summit by, I think he said like 1:30 or 2, like within the window before the turnaround time. Even though Rob Hall had not set a turnaround time, he had said like 1 or 2 o'clock. And so I think Jon Krakauer made it just barely in that window, didn't stay on the summit for too long, and turned around to come back down rather quickly, even though he then had to wait to get down. And that is sort of what helped him make it through, because they ended up staying on the top of Everest until, you know, people had summited at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
And then another storm hit, and that's when all hell broke loose.
So this is when, you know, Jon Krakauer had barely made it back to camp.
And he was a wreck.
And he was a wreck because they had run out of oxygen and there was no additional oxygen. In fact, one of the guides, I think it was Andy Harris, who was at the camp, had been saying on like the walkie-talkies that there was no oxygen at the balcony, I think is where he was waiting. That's where you get the extra oxygen to get back down. And he kept saying there was no oxygen, but in fact, his like regulator had broken on his oxygen. And so even though there was plenty of oxygen, he kept telling people there was none because his mind was playing tricks on him.
Yeah, and that ended up
poor Andy Harris.
And also awful are the descriptions of, you know, Jon Krakauer would get ahead and then he'd have to wait, and just waiting on the top of Everest to go down, and the bitter, bitter, bitter cold, and just standing there for like 45 minutes waiting until you'd see your guide or you'd get some signal you could go ahead. It sounded like agony.
It does. I mean, as I said, you have to be a very specific personality trait to like want to do this. But so he makes it back down and he is kind of destroyed. He had hallucinated a situation wherein he thinks he talks to, I think it's Andy Harris, but it's not real. It's very confusing as to like what happened, because he's in this state of confusion because of the lack of oxygen. But not too long after he arrives back at Camp 4, a storm hits, but there are lots of people still left out on the summit and coming down from the summit, and they don't know where they are. And it's a blizzard.
Yeah.
It's a blizzard and it's pure chaos, because as Jon Krakauer relates, he has an interaction with a man that he could swear was either Doug Hansen or Andy Harris. I think it was Doug Hansen.
I honestly can't remember now who it was, but
I think it
it's
was Doug
essentially a
Hansen.
hallucination. He like thinks he's talked to this person, only it's after later on he finds that it definitely wasn't that person.
It was
because that person
it was a different person because that
And the
person
problem
was
is,
somewhere else.
you've got all these family members who are anxiously waiting to hear from their loved ones. And Jon Krakauer gives this false information that he saw somebody who he didn't actually see. And so their family is temporarily relieved. And then it turns out that he actually didn't see him and the guy's dead. So
except he's not, he is dead, but he thinks he sees the guy. Then he says he's okay. Then he thinks that the guy is dead. So he tells the family and the family is miserable. And then he thinks that the guy's actually alive. So the family's relieved. And then it turns out that this guy's actually dead.
Yeah, and that's just one. Then we have like Buck Weathers, who we've talked about. I'm sorry, Beck Weathers, who we talked about, who's sort of trapped with these two other climbers.
He's trapped with the first Japanese woman to summit all 7 summits.
Yasuko Namba is her name.
Yeah, Yasuko Namba.
And then there's somebody else he's with.
There's a guide who I don't remember which guide. And then somebody named
stuck.
Sandy Pittman.
Yeah, and they're just stuck on the side of the mountain with this blizzard.
They're like 600 feet from Camp 4 and safety, essentially.
Yeah.
But there's such a blizzard going on, they can't see and they have no idea where they're going. So they end up just saying, screw it, we've got to like hunker down for the night. And they end up like 30 feet from the ledge.
And they end up covered in snow.
And covered in ice and snow.
And ice. And when rescuers try to go up and find them, they think that they're dead, because there's literally like a 3-inch layer of ice over their faces.
And I think
Yasuko Namba is
dead.
But Beck Weathers wasn't. But they thought they couldn't.
They thought that Beck Weathers was beyond saving. So there was another person there whose name I don't remember. But Yasuko Namba is dead. One of the people who was there goes back and gets help from Camp 4. And so a couple people come out who are somehow magically well enough to, including Anatoly Bukharev, who too much criticism had climbed down ahead of his clients and was resting in Camp 4.
Yes.
It turned out that saved a bunch of lives.
So
because he was rested enough that he could go out and try to rescue these people. So when they come and find Yasuko and Sandy and Beck, they take Sandy, they think Yasuko's dead, and then they take somebody else who I don't remember who they think can survive, and they leave Beck for dead.
And then miraculously,
which is interesting in and of itself, because like that was one of the hardest parts of the book to read, was like the morality of when you're that high up, there's no rescue. Remember, they can't get a helicopter up there to rescue you. So it literally has to be people carrying you down this very treacherous path to get you to base camp. So then they could airlift you to a hospital or something. And like, that's why there are so many dead bodies up there, is because like, there's nobody coming for you. And
there's nothing you can do.
There's nothing you can do. And the people who are there with you have to be worried about themselves. Really, it really becomes an every person for themselves kind of situation, which is really hard to read at that moment when they're like, well, she's dead. She's not worth the effort to like get down to camp.
Not worth the effort. When they'd make those heartbreaking decisions with Beck. But what happens is, Beck he's not dead. He's not dead. He comes to, if you read his memoir, he says that he wakes up, everything is white, and he thinks he's in Dallas, which is his hometown. And then he realizes that his arms are frozen solid. And then he remembers, oh, I'm not in Dallas. Maybe I should stand up. I'm on the top of Mount Everest. I'm on Everest. I better stand up and just find base camp or die trying. And he stands up. It's just miraculous. And he walks into base camp like a dead man. And
they're all shocked because they thought he was dead. For dead.
Yeah.
So that being said, Rob Hall is still on the summit when the storm hits, because he's waiting for Doug Hansen, because it's Doug's last chance. And I think Rob felt for the man, because this had been his 3rd attempt and he really wanted him to be able to make it.
Right. And they were good friends.
And so he was waiting for him, and he was taking a really long, he was much older. I think he was in his 50s. Like he wasn't a young a young gentleman with lots of energy. He was
Right.
much older. And so he was one of the last people to make it up to the summit. And they heard from Rob at some point in the afternoon after the storm hit, and then they just didn't hear from them again. Neither one, I think, survived, Rob Hall or Doug Hansen.
Neither of them survived.
At one point, they would get these little snippets where they would be able to make contact with Rob Hall. Like near the end, they put him through to his wife. It's really heartbreaking, and his wife was like 7 months pregnant with their first child, who is now, I believe, also a mountaineer. But they put him through to his wife, and there's a recording you can hear, a transcript of their last conversation, which of course they do up in the Everest movie.
But they name their child.
Yeah.
On that phone call.
Yeah. Oh,
it's really
that's
sad.
heartbreaking.
It's really
that's
really
heartbreaking.
Sad. Anyway, she looks like him. I think her name is Sarah Hall.
Oh, that's so sad. That is. Oh, and now the kid is a mountaineer. I mean, I don't know that I could do that.
I think she does some climbing. She's never been to Everest, and I think that's intentional.
I wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah,
but
so then Rob Hall dies. Scott Fisher, the other major expedition leader, competing with Rob Hall, he dies. Everyone dies.
Not everyone.
Not everyone dies. Scott Fisher, Rob Hall, Andy Harris, Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, and then 3 Sherpas die on May 10th to 11th.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So this book doesn't end on any upper note.
I mean, I think that it definitely doesn't end on an upper note, because then, they have to come back down. Like, nobody's coming to save them. So they not only after this like terrible tragedy, but they still get themselves back down.
They leave Beck Weathers for dead again.
Yep.
Beck Weathers is like a cat.
He's in Camp 4 in a tent. Everybody else, they need to get down because they don't have enough oxygen to stay up there. Beck Weathers, they assume, is about to die. They leave him in Camp 4 for dead. He shows up miraculously at Camp 3.
Yeah, well, it's because of Jon Krakauer, I think, because John poked his head into Beck's tent and sees that his sleeping bag blew off in the middle of the night. So he was exposed to all the cold.
But other people think he's going to die. He's not the only one. Other people think he's going to die too.
Right.
And once again, you have to make the choice what's best for you to survive. It's a real survivalist. It's a very survivalist book.
And clearly Krakauer is dealing with PTSD after
Here we are with our favorite topic again, PTSD.
Yeah. I mean, he's really messed up from this experience. Now, if you read Beck Weathers' memoir, it's more hopeful because he describes the disaster, but then he describes how he coped with it, the aftermath, and actually how he rebuilt his life. And his marriage was actually saved kind of because of certain things relating to the expedition. And is that Jonathan?
It is, yeah. He drove me.
Oh, it's so cute. And yeah. I forget what I'm saying, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I also think that Jon Krakauer wrote this so that he could explain more about the article that he wrote that he was required to write as part of it. And I think part of it was also to make sense to himself of how he managed to survive and so many people didn't. I mean, I think survivor's guilt is really a huge thing. And I think he felt really guilty about having survived when so many others didn't. And to be able, and especially like the leaders of the group didn't make it, like it just, so many people lost their lives. And I feel like that's got to be really hard to be like, and I'm one of the few who made it.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think I would have a really hard time coming to terms with that. There would have to be lots of therapy involved. I hope for their sake that they all got therapy when they got home and were able to start processing what happened.
Well, some of them were considered celebrities and some of them got really negative feedback, like Sandy Pittman.
who had been, well, and so there was a question about Sandy Pittman was the woman, right? And that the Sherpa like tried to drag her up the mountain.
She was she was a millionaire. She was a socialite, and people
She'd
were
gotten a lot of help getting up the mountain.
yeah.
And then
yeah,
like at the top, the Sherpa was like, well, I needed to make sure she made it because she was famous. And Scott Fisher would have wanted me to make sure she made it up there. But in the end, it was not. That meant that the Sherpa didn't have enough energy and enough oxygen, I think, to get back down.
He survived, actually.
Oh, that's impressive. But still, like that caused a lot of drama.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of personalities and a lot of people. And as we said, there were not supposed to be as many people trying to summit on that day, and yet there were.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh no, you should finish because I wanted to say
I was just going to say, and
yeah.
that still continues to this day. Like I was watching while I'm reading this book, I'm looking up, about, Everest, and, there are lots of articles about how Everest is just as crowded. And now, when they start leaving in the middle of the night to start climbing, you just see a parade of lights going up because there's so many people trying to summit. There's still plenty of deaths that happened. And at this point, I think that was the most devastating day, like the most number of deaths in a day on Everest. But like, I think, Aaron, weren't you the one who said it, like in comparison to the year before?
That's what I wanted to end on.
Oh, go ahead.
Compare, there were so many people on Everest that compared to other years, this was actually one of the least deadly years. Over all time, for every 4 people who have summited Everest, 1 person has died on Everest.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a 25% death rate.
Yeah.
No, that doesn't mean that 25% of the people who summit die.
Oh, math is not my strong suit. I'm a librarian.
That means that for every 4 people who summit, 1 dies.
I'm just going to say it's a math, and I can't do the math.
It's a math.
It's a math.
The other statistic is that year, 3.3% of all people who were on Everest in any way, shape, or form died.
That's definitely a math, and also sad.
Yeah, normally, the average overall time is 3%, which is not very different, but that's still like a couple of people's lives that were lost.
Yeah, when you're counting like this, it's in people's lives, not like jelly beans I didn't eat out of the canister. That's all we have for you about Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Be sure to check out our next episode when it's released on October 15th. Forever Shelfmates is produced in collaboration with an incredible team of people. Our logo was designed by Mirele and Miriam Goldell. Our theme song was written by Mirele and Noah Osofsky and was performed by Abby Chessman. Our producer is Aaron Adams, and our show is hosted by Mirele and me, Cheryl Fox Strasberg. That's all we have for you this time. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at @4 Ever Shelfmates for the most up-to-date news on production. Next time, we will be reading Fatty Fatty Boom Boom by Rabia Chaudry. Thank you for listening.